don't believe it changes the motion, but it was a welcome clarification. So we're gonna go with the question again. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 All those opposed by saying nay. And the rule has been approved. Thank you very much. And we will move on to
Thank you.
the next one. Yep. P21, 21P18, Agency of Natural Resources Biomass Renewable Energy Standards. Two witnesses. We have two witnesses, Emma Hansen from the Wood Energy Coordinator, Vermont Department of Forestry, Parks and Recreation, and Megan Purvey, General Counsel for Forest, Parks and Recreation. Ms. Hansen, you're listed. Ms. Hansen, you're listed first. Would you like to share with us the rule?
Yes, thank you, Chair. For the record, my name is Emma Hansen, and I am the Wood Energy Coordinator at the Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation. And as you mentioned, I'm here to present the proposed Biomass Renewable Energy Standard Rule. I'll walk you through a brief synopsis of the rule, and then Megan and I are happy to take any questions you may have. The purpose of this proposed rule is to promote the sustainable use of forest resources and ensure long-term forest health as biomass is utilized in the Tier 2 and Tier 3 programs. Our approach with this rule is to take existing standards and apply them to the context of forest health and energy. The rule is divided into two distinct parts. The first part is for Tier 2, distributed renewable generation. And for that, there's a couple of categories. For material coming from forest land within Vermont, if it's enrolled and in good standing with UVA, then that material is automatically eligible. If it's material coming from within Vermont that is not enrolled in UVA, then they have the option to have a certified forester, a licensed forester certify that the harvest and the forest land complies with UVA management equivalents. If the material is coming from forest land from outside of Vermont, then a licensed forester in that state or an SAF certified forester may again certify that the harvest in the forest land complies with UVA standards. Then any material from whether it's coming from in Vermont or outside of Vermont that comes from a harvest that converts forest land to non-forest land is not eligible. The second section of the rule is for Tier 3, that's the energy transformation projects. And for those, we relied on an efficiency standard. So you can see the table in the rule is, I think, the easiest way to digest the different efficiency standards for the different types of wood burning equipment. And our approach with that was to make sure that we were getting as much energy as possible out of the forest resource. And that's the brief synopsis of the rule. I'm happy to elaborate, or I can go ahead and take any questions you may have.
Questions for the witness? Are there any questions for the witness? Senator Lyons.
I think I had my hand up first. Excuse me. A quick question about the land conservation area, that wood sourced from forestry operations being converted from forest to non-forest. How is that section enforced? How do you know that the wood that you're getting that's being utilized for heat is authentic and not coming from a conversion?
That would be under the section, because UVA land would not be converted from forest to non-forest. So you would have to have a forester certify any other material that's non-UVA. And it's the responsibility of the energy facility, so any new Tier 2 plants that were taking this material, to hold on to that information and a copy of the forester's license about material they were taking in that's non-UVA.
So it's the forester who makes the certification, but then what about the logger, the company that's actually extracting the wood and taking it to a facility? Is there any responsibility there? I know that sometimes we've seen problems at that level. So I don't need to go into too much depth on this at this point, but just a clarification if you have it.
Sure. As written, the rule says that it is the responsibility of the energy generating facility to hold on to paperwork from material coming in from non-UVA parcels and the certification of the forester. So it would be up to that forester to make sure that what they were giving them is what they say it is.
Thank you.
Any other further questions? So, Representative Bongartz.
Hi, Ms. Henson. Can you elaborate a little bit on the second part you mentioned about the efficiency of the I guess the equipment? Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know if you have the rule in front of you. We broke the efficiency standards out by type of appliance. And so where possible, we leaned on EPA efficiency standards. So for example, EPA certified wood stoves, EPA certified pellet stoves, anything that had a relevant EPA efficiency certification, we wrote the rule so that it says that appliance must be EPA certified on its date of installation. And where an EPA certification wasn't relevant, we went with an industry standard for a high performance equivalent.
Okay, I was thinking about, I don't want to drag this out, but just a little bit about schools. And that then those, because my guess is no two of those are the same, or are they?
No, I mean, certainly every installation in a school can vary. But the certifications we put in are standards that are, the efficiency standards we put in are standards that are high performing but achievable. Yep. And we checked with the industry to make sure that that was the case. And also, if for some reason a school wanted to put in a boiler that didn't meet these efficiency standards, maybe it was 2 percentage points shy of meeting the standard, but otherwise was absolutely perfect for their setup, they can still do that. They just wouldn't be able to accept a tier 3 incentive for that project.
Okay, thank you.
There is reference, there's Senator Bray.
No, please go ahead, Senator McDonald.
There's reference in the rules for thermal use of forestry products, and then there is reference for electric generation of using forest harvested products. What's the difference in the rule on how those two different uses are treated?
Well, the electric generation would fall under tier 2. So that's where we're leaning on the UVA standards as the applicable or equivalent standard to forest land management and harvest. And then for the thermal generation, that really falls under tier 3.
So if when it comes to enforcement, there are two levels of, I say two levels of enforcement. One is, are the forestry practices what they are supposed to be? How does a forester know when a harvest is taking place? And does the forester receive notification of the approximate date of the harvest so as the forester can observe and report on the completion of the proper completion of the harvest?
That's a good question. The exact specifics of that are not spelled out in the rule. My best answer at this time would be that if a landowner hired a forester to help them execute a harvest on their forest land that was not enrolled in UVA, because again, if their land is enrolled in UVA and in good standing, then it's already good to go without any additional steps. So if a forester or forest land owner of non-UVA land hired a forester to help them execute a harvest, they could indicate to that forester, or the forester could indicate to the landowner that their intended market is a biomass electric facility and that they would need to comply with this rule.
Thank you, that's the law. Is there any mechanism in the rules that the harvesters of such forest land notify the inspectors of such forest land of when the harvest will take place so that it can be observed and inspected by the inspectors?
There is no inspector as written. It relies on the licensure of the forester, and it would be effectively a complaint-based system. If someone suspected that a harvest was not executed to the way that the forester had claimed and put their license on the line for, then the energy facility that accepted that material kept the records for a minimum of 4 years, and so they'd be able to go back and check that at that time.
Second question, when the product leaves the harvest area, how does the system verify that the product has gone where it has been represented to have gone? What record keeping or what ability is there to make sure that when the truck leaves the harvest, that it goes to the place that is supposed to go?
Well, there isn't a specific tracking system as part of this. But again, the energy facility keep track of the records of material that it accepts. And the licensure of the forester involved is on the line in terms of their credibility and their career. So that is really the main mechanism, but there isn't a written in tracking system from the harvest to the facility.
Well, the foresters don't drive the trucks. The foresters are on site when the truck leaves. And if the forester's credibility is on the line and the truck doesn't go where it's supposed to go, the forester is held responsible, or the certification of the facility is withdrawn? What happens in that circumstance? And how does the Department of Forestry ensure that such a thing doesn't happen?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that maybe that's something that we should follow up with you about after the meeting. And I've had a chance to collaborate on that with my colleagues.
And
it looks like
fine.
Megan might want to respond.
Chair McDonald and committee, if I might add, I think that some of the issues you're addressing relate to the statutory process for UVA itself and how that program is operated. And so some of the protections and insurances come through, for land enrolled in UVA, come through the UVA program itself with respect to when it's harvested, how every land enrolled has to have a forest management plan. So they would be required to comply with that. So the rule requires that they're not only enrolled, but they're in good standing in the UVA program. So that would address some of the harvest issues that you're speaking to. And as for when the product is moved and where it's moved, that would rely back on the facilities that are claiming this incentive. They, as Emma spoke to, are required to have either the UVA enrollment or a forester that's certified, and they would be the entity that would be responsible for ensuring that the materials they acquire are coming from a harvest that complies with these standards. And if it's discovered that their certification is inaccurate, then they would not be eligible for the incentive.
So these questions have been asked in previous years. And we have people that are responsible and whose licenses are on the line but the inspector to verify that what should take place has in fact taken place are not notified of a harvest, so they're not there to see what goes on. The product goes on trucks. It need not have records of where the truck has left and where it is going to. And other people's licenses are on the line, but there's no system to verify what's actually happening. That's been unchanged for several years. My final question is, has to do with the change in the industry for chips and harvests, where many of the plants in the greater area of Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont have closed. And there's a fraction of the market that there used to be. And this puts great pressure on foresters that have mortgages on their equipment and truckers that have mortgages on their trucks, in a market where sales are way, way down because of the closure of many large consumers. Has the agency feel any sense of urgency in dealing with the verification of the harvest and movement of this product, or do we continue to have the same rules which do not appear to have enforcement mechanisms built into those rules?
I believe we are in this rule relying on the utilities and the entities that are seeking the incentive. And certainly with respect to utilities that I think are a large user of chips and other forest products, they have foresters that oversee the process, and they have standards. Beyond that, we haven't proposed anything else.
We've established that there is no required notification process of the harvest taking place at any particular time. So since no one knows when the harvests are going on, how can far-flung entities who are on the hook for certification verify what they don't know what's going on? So I'm going to stop asking questions, but I've asked them because these questions don't have answers. And we are dealing with rules that appear to me to be unenforceable. So I'll stop. Are there any further questions for the witnesses? Senator Bray.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thanks to Forest Parks and Rec for coming in and explaining the rule. I'm just trying to reconcile this rule. It doesn't exist, sort of in a vacuum. There's other rules related to forestry around it. So can you say a little bit about how procurement standards and harvesting guidelines are or are not a part of this rule? I mean, our committee has talked about those for years, and I'd like to understand how they are knit together in a way so we're optimizing forest health while also harvesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, the majority of material, especially from, well, naturally in Vermont, would likely be coming from land that is enrolled in UVA, which has standards applicable to harvest and forest management. And for the non-UVA enrolled land, if this forester would have to certify that non-UVA enrolled land is meeting those same standards applicable to harvest, the AMPs, and all applicable Vermont forestry laws. And for material coming from outside of Vermont, the forester who's licensed in that state or the SAF certified forester would again have to certify that the material is coming from forest land and that the harvest complies with the standards from UVA applicable to harvest, the AMPs, and all the local forestry laws.
Okay. So would, for a smaller facility that might take advantage of this rule and in terms of like tier 2 credits, or for instance, but I'm thinking about something can you compare that or a school? Representative Bongart's talked about school systems, the standards in this rule compared to the standards that someone like the McNeil generating plant would be held to, which I think has both harvesting guidelines and for its contracts, as well as procurement standards on its side.
Sure. So those are two really distinct things, because the school isn't, well, highly unlikely that the school is going to become an electric generating facility. A school would be purchasing a boiler or a furnace for thermal generation. So they'd be falling under that tier 3 section, which is just the efficiency standard. The harvesting guidelines do not apply to the tier 3 section at all. The harvesting guidelines just apply to the tier 2 section, which is the distributed energy generation. And this wouldn't apply to McNeil or Reigate as is, it would just apply to new tier 2 facilities.
Okay. And I think, so one of the conversations that went on at length in looking in committee and in previous years was around harvesting guidelines and forest health. And so can you say why, if you're qualifying for tier 2, you do have a sort of a higher standard than if you're buying an appliance? Like, I'm just wondering what, it seems less protective of forest health to apply a lower standard to another category of, for appliances being used for heat as opposed to generating electricity. If I were to say it another way, from the forest's health point of view, it doesn't matter why the product is leaving the woods, it's still leaving. So why would we be any less protective over how we harvest?
Yeah, I understand the question. And as we were designing this rule, we went through several iterations and considered that exact point. But ultimately, we concluded that trying to dictate the type of fuel and the source of fuel and the match of the fuel going into every individual wood stove, pellet boiler was just not going to be something that we were able to enforce or execute in a meaningful way. And so, which is why we ended up opting for an efficiency standard, so that we could at least be making sure that we were getting as much energy out of the material, out of that forest resource as possible.
Sure. Well, I fully appreciate you don't want to be chasing down every wood stove in the state of Vermont to see what's going in. I'm thinking though on the sourcing end, why we would have different standards. So if it's still a licensed forester reviewing a job and seeing how it's managed for cut, I'm not sure why it's any more demanding on the forester and that job to say that you will always use that more stringent standard that is entailed when you're harvesting for electrical generation, as opposed to just for pure heat use. I mean, it seems like a more manageable thing. You go upstream to the job, and then you don't worry about where it's ultimately destined to be used.
I think I understand what you're saying. Let me summarize just to make sure that I'm understanding your question correctly. Is you would suggest that we apply the same tier 2 harvesting standards to wood fuels that were going to thermal generation as well, whether that be in the form of cordwood, wood pellets, or wood chips?
Correct.
All right, I understand your question and where you're going with it, but I think that the enforcement of that would be extremely difficult, because the thermal side is so diffuse in terms of where that fuel comes from. If firewood dealers can be anything from one man in a truck to an entire pellet manufacturer. Whereas with the tier 2 standards, because of the orders of magnitude of material that go into them, and because they're central facilities, holding on to that record keeping is something that we feel is achievable in terms of enforcement.
Okay. One more question on this one, and that is, so there was a biomass energy development working group. Senator Lyons and I both served on that years ago. It was focused on this very issue, maximizing our ability to harvest wood while maintaining forest health. And So some of these questions all date back to those conversations. And it's a little concerning to me to see that we're bringing the more discerning lens only to the electrical generation side and kind of using UVA enrollment as a proxy for harvesting guidelines on all the other jobs. And so, you know, I don't have more questions on that. I do have two other questions, or one question with two parts. We've just developed a comprehensive energy plan on the 6-year cycle. It's just about to be certified. And we just passed the Global Warming Solutions Act, which also addresses the use of biomass. As you developed this rule, you all approached the finish line at about the same time. Did you have an opportunity to reconcile this rule with any kind of demands that come out of GWSA or the CEP?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it did turn out to be interesting timing that all those things conflated at the same time. But we did consider that the fact that those two other processes were happening simultaneously as we headed into our final stretch as well. And ultimately, we concluded that because our charge as mandated by the legislature was strictly forest health and really nothing else, so our results and how we went about this would be the same regardless of how biomass was treated in the CEP or the GWSA, because our charge would be whatever wood energy is utilized, we need to be monitoring the forest health in that. So we decided that our outcome would be the same regardless of the outcomes of those other processes.
Okay.
Senator Bray, you and I are both members of the Natural Resources Committee, and we're perhaps taking more time than other committees might get on this issue. I know how I'm going to vote on this, but there are Vermonters all over this state that agonize every time they go to get a car inspected because they know they have to do it on a certain date. They know there'll be an inspector, and they know if they don't have their car correct, they're going to pay. And the new car dealers support that vigorously because the people that get a car inspected know what inspections are. What we're being handed today doesn't have in any way, shape, or form appear to have the same sort of rigor and systematic checks. It's all, oh, you tell us your car is good? Okay, fine. This is this one member of this committee's opinion is not acceptable. But we're not going to solve that here today. We're going to vote on the rule that's before us. So do we have any other questions for the witnesses? Senator Lyons. You're muted.
Not actually a question as much as to add to the list for you who are on natural resources and energy, and that is to look at labeling for chips. And I know that I spent a good deal of time talking with folks in Stockbridge who were producing wood chips and the content of those chips to ensure that they weren't going to cause a public health problem. So the link between the forest and the manufacturer and then the user. So just another minor detail in the supply chain. We've had enough of supply chains for a while, but something else.
Thank you. Any other questions from the witnesses, or do we have a motion? Senator Representative Higley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Like you said, I know how I'm going to vote on this. I am going to be supportive. There is a lot coming down the pike. I'm actually pretty concerned about what came out with the Climate Council's report. So we've got a lot of discussion ahead of us, but I'm ready to vote in favor of this proposal. Thank you.
Is that a motion, Representative Higley?
Yes, it is.
Senator Representative Higley has moved that the rules be approved as set forth, and we have our council perhaps has some advice.
Mr. Chair,
Yeah.
it should, I guess it looks like there's a modification proposed by the Department of Forest Parks and Recs in a letter, and I don't have the dates there, but looks like a couple of dates.
It looks, perhaps our council was going to refer to those letters and dates.
Yes, this one's just one letter and it's January 12th, 2022.
Representative Higley has moved that the rule be approved with the letter aforementioned as part of his motion. Is that correct?
Yes.
Is there any discussion? If not, please unmute yourself. All those in favor say aye.
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 1, 2, 3, 4, I believe. All those opposed say nay. No. 2. So that would be 5-2. The motion passes, carries 5-2, and we have approved the rule. Thank you very much, witnesses, for your testimony, and we will endeavor to get on to our final rule of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. 21P32, Department of Disabilities, licensing and operating regulations for therapeutic community residences. And I do not have the witness list before me. My apologies. Those who is here to speak to that rule.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. This is Stuart Scher.
Mr. Stuart Scher. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Stuart Scher. I'm the General Counsel for the Department of Disabilities, Aging and Independent Living, commonly known as DALE, because that is a mouthful. I'll use the acronym. We are here seeking to amend the licensing and operating regulations for therapeutic community residences, also known as TCRs, which were adopted pursuant to rulemaking authority that was set forth in 33 VSA 7117. And we last amended these rules in 2014, January of 2014. Through Act number 160 of 2012, you may recall that the legislature directed DALE to adopt rules to include specific requirements for the operation of secure residential recovery facilities. And this was completed in January of 2014. Just by way of background, a TCR is defined by statute, and it's defined in these regulations as a place, however named, which provides transitional, individualized treatment to 3 or more residents with major life adjustment problems. So this proposed amendment is fairly narrow in scope, with the exception of some minor housekeeping corrections, which I can certainly address. The primary purpose of this rule is to incorporate terms that were negotiated between the state of Vermont, specifically the Agency of Human Services, and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services in the course of the most recent serious mental illness and institutions for mental disease waiver negotiations. And specifically, CMS required the state to incorporate into these specific rules a provision that ensures that both psychiatric hospitals and residential settings contact beneficiaries and community-based providers through the most effective means possible within 72 hours of a resident's discharge. And as a result, the state has incorporated that requirement into these TCR rules. And that is incorporated in section 5.4C. As I mentioned before, there are some other minor housekeeping changes. Specifically, we've updated the address and contact information, which have changed significantly since we last amended this rule in 2014. But beyond that, the primary purpose here is to simply comply with the negotiated terms of that agreement with CMS and to incorporate this provision in the rule. By way of public comment, we did in fact post this rule on our website. We held a public hearing on October 27th. No one attended that meeting. which was offered both virtually and in person. And in fact, we didn't receive any public comments during the comment period before it closed on November 5th. We would ask that the committee approve this rule. And I'm certainly available to answer any questions you may have.
Questions for the witness? Senator Lyons, you are muted.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have just a couple of questions, and I do see on page 23 of the annotated version, the language, the 72-hour language that the CMS required. There are other sort of more discrete changes in the rules, and I just want some clarification, please, on those. Overall, it looks like the improvement looks good. So on page 4, I'm looking at annotated because it's easier to know where the changes have been made.
Sure.
But on page 4, you have and/or loss of license, suspension and/or loss of license. So you've changed it to and. And just what that is at the top under 1.6. And it says suspension and then you've crossed out or revocation of license.
Yes. I think it's a distinction without much of a difference, other than to list all of the possible consequences of a violation. It does suggest that it's not simply one option, but there are a multitude of remedies that are available.
Okay. Yeah, no, I'm actually okay with that. I just wanted to hear an explanation. And then I did have something on 46, but I think it's a moot point. The page 47 of the annotated, you have crossed out abuse, you've crossed out harassment. So, and I think someone else asked the same question. Someone else on LCAR also had a similar question. Can you indicate why harassment was eliminated there?
Certainly. And first of all, I also want to mention that the annotated version does strike harassment, and Legislative Counsel correctly pointed out earlier this week that the clean copy did not strike that. That was an oversight. It is intended to be struck. And the reason is that abuse is more comprehensive. It does include harassment. If we look at the definition of abuse, it would include such things as treatment that places life, health, or welfare in jeopardy. It's conduct that's committed with intent or reckless disregard, likely to cause unnecessary harm, pain, or suffering, unnecessary or unlawful confinement or restraint, or intentionally subjecting an individual to behavior that's reasonably expected to result in intimidation, fear, humiliation, degradation, agitation, disorientation, or other serious emotional distress. So
Okay.
that definition is much more comprehensive than simply harassment.
Thank you. That helps a great deal. I'm all set. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Questions for the witness? What's the committee's pleasure?
Mr. Chair, I move that we approve 21P32 with that minor change of striking harassment in the final copy that was intended to be struck, and I don't have the page number in the clean copy.
Senator Lyons has moved to approve the rule with the minor change dealing with removing the word harassment. Is there any further discussion? If not, please unmute yourselves. And all those in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye.
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 Those opposed, say nay. And it appears that we have 5 votes from the 5 remaining members of the committee, and the motion passes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Charlene, anything that thank you, Mr. Scher. Charlene, do we have anything we need to know before we adjourn? It's coming up on other committees' time.
Only that you will not have a meeting next week. The next meeting is the 27th. So you get a break.
Motion would be in order.
I move we
We have a motion
adjourn.
to
Thank
adjourn?
you, adjourn. Thank you, Charlene. I move we adjourn.
The adjournment motion is before us. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say nay. Thank you very much. Thanks for your patience as we squeezed our work into the time allotted. Have a good one. See you in 2 weeks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ms. Representative Higley.